Have you ever wondered why a man seems more alive in your absence than in your presence? Why he suddenly begins to see your face in strangers, to hear your voice in dreams, only after you've gone silent? There is a particular ache that blooms inside a man when a woman detaches without warning. Not the kind of ache that comes with ordinary loss. No, this is the ache of existential disruption, of ego fragmentation. A deep, unnameable disturbance that claws at the roots of his constructed identity. He may not even understand it at first, but his unconscious does. It knows something sacred has slipped away, and the silence you leave behind does not echo, it haunts. Carl Jung once wrote that the anima, the feminine image in a man's psyche, is not simply a projection. She is his guide to wholeness, to the lost parts of himself he has long rejected. And when you walk away, not in anger, not in drama, but with quiet sovereignty, you awaken that archetype. You stir something primordial within him, a memory of the divine feminine, a reflection he cannot control, seduce, or dismiss. Most men live in a quiet illusion that the women in their lives will always remain available, emotionally responsive, endlessly forgiving. Society feeds this entitlement. But when a woman breaks that pattern, when she leaves the stage without a final monologue, he is forced to confront something terrifying, his own emptiness. You see, most of what he showed you wasn't himself. It was his mask. The persona he stitched together from childhood wounds and social conditioning. But you saw beneath it. You touched the tender, unformed places he was too ashamed to name. And now that you're gone, he realizes something chilling. It wasn't just you he lost. It was the only mirror that ever reflected his true face. There is nothing more psychologically destabilizing for a man than losing the one woman who held space for both his beauty and his brokenness. And when you detach without warning, not as a weapon, but as a final act of self-honor, you initiate a crisis in his unconscious. This is not about revenge. This is about reflection. The feminine doesn't punish, she reveals. And what she reveals when she exits is his shadow. The parts of himself he tried to bury in performance, sarcasm, silence. Now they rise like ghosts in your absence. He sees the boy who never learned how to receive love, the man who confused dominance with intimacy, the fear that every woman will eventually leave because deep down he feels unworthy of being kept. The detachment of a conscious woman acts like a mirror turned inward. It doesn't scream, it doesn't chase, it simply ends. And that ending echoes through the very architecture of a man's psyche. If he was sleepwalking before, he is wide awake now, and haunted. He replays your last words, not to understand them, but to hear what you didn't say. He scrolls through old photos and wonders when your eyes stopped softening around him. He might distract himself. New women, louder laughs, longer nights. But eventually, when silence stretches too wide, he realizes something harrowing. No one else holds the key to that sacred place you unlocked. And here lies the paradox. He may have pushed you away precisely because he felt too exposed. The anima, that deep feminine energy, doesn't just arouse or nurture. She dismantles, she sees. And many men, unprepared for that kind of nakedness, retreat into egoic control. But what happens when the woman stops trying to explain, to fix, to prove her love? When she simply becomes air? When she vanishes into her own healing? Something ancient stirs. His rational mind will resist this truth. He might say, she was too much, or she left for no reason. But the body tells a different story. The chest tightens at the sound of your name. The dreams turn vivid. The songs feel different. The nervous system knows what the mind tries to forget. You weren't just a woman. You were a threshold. A man who loses a woman that mirrored his soul is not losing a relationship. He's losing access to his own expansion. And in the beginning, he may not even know how to grieve it. He may feel irritation before sorrow, confusion before clarity. But deep in the quiet of night, when the masks fall and the ego loosens its grip, he will feel it. That something sacred has gone still, that the goddess has returned to herself, and that he, the man who couldn't meet her there, must now walk through the labyrinth alone. At first, he might not recognize the loss as spiritual. He might call it chemistry, timing, a connection he can't explain. But beneath those hollow labels, his psyche trembles, because what he's actually facing is the loss of the numinous, the sacred, the inexplicable, the feminine soul that once held him like a prayer. And now, without warning, the prayer has ended, the sanctuary has closed, and the silence you leave behind is not absence, it is initiation. Carl Jung warned that the anima is not a comfort, she is a storm. She arrives to soften the hardened, to fracture the false, and most men, unprepared for that inner quake, resist her, until she's gone, until the warmth that once held space for his chaos no longer answers the door. And suddenly, the very things he took for granted, your softness, your presence, your attention, become luxuries he no longer owns. He remembers your quiet eyes, the ones that didn't just look at him, but into him. Eyes that didn't demand, but invited. Eyes that made him feel, for a fleeting moment, that he could put down the armor. And now those eyes are closed to him. No fight, no final plea. Just the hollow sound of a door closing in a sacred hallway of his unconscious mind. That's what makes your detachment so devastating. It doesn't come as punishment. It comes as peace. And peace, when undeserved, becomes unbearable. You must understand, the masculine psyche is built on control, predictability, reaction. And when you remove your energy, not with rage but with radiance, he has nothing to control, nothing to push against, nothing to manipulate. He is left in the stillness of himself. And if he hasn't done the inner work, that stillness feels like death. Some men will collapse into regret. Others will rage. Some will distract themselves with noise. Women, money, status, logic. But in quiet hours when all the mirrors are covered and the lights are low, he will feel it. Not guilt. The ego doesn't like guilt. He will feel loss. Pure, holy, irreversible loss. Because he didn't just lose a lover, he lost a mirror, a spiritual container, the one woman who didn't reflect his ego, but his essence. And now that essence goes unwitnessed. His jokes don't land the same. His victories feel hollow. His life continues, yes, but it moves without music. And he can't explain why the silence haunts him so deeply. But you know why. Because feminine energy is not a mood. It is medicine. It is memory. It is the ache of something once felt in the soul, now unreachable. You were never just there. You were present. You held him in ways no language could ever hold. You saw his chaos and didn't flinch. You felt his inner fracture and stayed soft. You loved not just who he showed you, but the parts of him even he tried to exile. And still, you left. Not because you stopped loving, but because you started remembering. Remembering that the love you gave him was always yours to keep. That your ability to feel him was a reflection of your own depth, not his. That the silence he now drowns in is the very silence you learned to breathe through. This is what the feminine does when she wakes up. She does not argue. She does not perform. She remembers. Her body, her spirit, her boundaries become sacred ground. And when a man cannot meet her there, not just emotionally but consciously, she does not beg. She does not explain. She simply walks. And when she walks, she takes something, invisible with her, a piece of the mystery, the anima energy that once danced around him like candlelight. Gone. That's what he feels, even if he doesn't know the name for it. The sudden coldness in rooms where your presence used to warm the air. The aching nostalgia for a laugh that wasn't loud, but real. The craving not for your body, but for your being. He may chase others. He may rebuild his world. But no matter how far he runs, he will carry this scar. The memory of a woman who did not fight to be chosen. A woman who chose herself. And that memory, that ache, becomes his silent teacher. There is no ego defense strong enough to mute that kind of memory. No logic can dissolve the way a man feels when a woman detaches with quiet conviction. Not rejection, not punishment, but sovereignty. It's a wound he can't name because it's not of the flesh. It's a wound of the psyche, a rupture in the archetypal dance he thought he could control. Because to the unconscious male mind, the feminine was always supposed to stay. She was the ever-giving well, the emotional hearth, the unseen servant of his inner world. She was comfort, validation, forgiveness on demand, until she wasn't. Until the one woman who could hold all his contradictions without judgment stopped holding. Until the echo of her absence became louder than her presence ever was. And this is where the pain begins to transform. Because when he can no longer pull from her energy, he must turn inward. For perhaps, the first time in his life, he must sit in his own stillness, face his own demons, and ask himself the question he's always avoided. What am I without her reflection? This is the threshold Jung spoke of, the gateway between persona and self, between unconscious projection and conscious integration. When the woman leaves the man's life, but not his soul, she becomes a symbol, a living archetype, not a ghost of romance but a messenger of transformation. And depending on his inner readiness, she will either haunt him or awaken him. For the man who still clings to ego, the loss feels like theft. She abandoned me, he tells himself. She was too sensitive, too complex, too much. But the soul beneath the armor whispers a different truth. She saw you, and you couldn't bear to be seen. That is what he truly mourns. Not your touch, but your sight. The way your gaze pierced through every mask, every illusion, every defense, and loved him anyway. The way your silence now forces him to hear his own thoughts without distraction. The way your withdrawal strips away the fantasy and leaves him face to face with his shadow. Most men were never taught to meet the feminine in her spiritual form. They were taught to pursue her in flesh, not in soul. To own, not to honor. To impress, not to attune. But when a woman detaches from a man who is never fully present, she awakens the deepest feminine force of all, the unknown. And men fear the unknown more than death. It is in your silence that he finally hears the scream of his own inadequacy. It is in your absence that he recognizes how dependent he was on your light. Not to love you, but to avoid himself. Because the truth is, he didn't love you fully. Not in the way love demands. He loved how you made him feel. He loved the peace you embodied, the depth he hadn't yet earned. He loved you like a mirror, not like a soul. But mirrors are fragile, and when they crack, they don't shatter, they reflect differently. And that's what you became. A reflection that no longer flattered, no longer softened, no longer stayed. Now, he sits in the ruins of his illusion, and maybe, just maybe, he begins to change. Not because he wants you back, but because you left. Your departure was not abandonment, it was alchemy. And if he's wise, if his spirit is ready, he'll begin the work. He'll enter the lonely terrain of his unconscious, descend into the underworld of his own dysfunction, and meet the shadows you used to hold for him. He'll begin to feel instead of flee, to listen instead of control, to love, not to possess but to witness. But even if he doesn't, even if he chooses distraction over depth, silence over accountability, ego over essence, you will remain. Not as a fantasy, but as a fork in his road. The moment he lost the one woman who didn't demand his growth, but required it. And you will have become the woman who no longer waits for men to rise. The woman who rises alone. Not to escape love, but to meet it. In its purest, fiercest, most sacred form. The kind that begins with you. Because when you detach, you do not disappear. You transmute, you reclaim, you remember, and in remembering your worth, you remind the world and him that the feminine does not chase. She calls, she invites, and when that call is dishonored, she leaves with grace. Not to wound, but to awaken. He might try to replace you, quickly, carelessly, a revolving door of distractions cloaked in desire, hoping that repetition will numb the singular wound. He'll convince himself it was nothing, that your presence was temporary, that your exit was just another chapter in the story he controls. But even the strongest illusions falter in the quiet hours, because your energy wasn't casual, it wasn't disposable, it wasn't born of the superficial hunger that fades when fed. It was deeper than form, more ancient than memory. And when you detached, you didn't just remove your voice, your body, your affection. You withdrew your spiritual permission. You stopped holding space for the boy who refused to become a man. Carl Jung spoke of how every man carries within him the seed of the feminine, the anima. Not the lover in the world, but the guide within. She is not the woman he desires. She is the woman who awakens. And when you walked away, you activated that inner force. Not the goddess who stays and soothes, the goddess who leaves and transforms. He will feel it in ways he cannot name. In the way his jokes fall flat. In the moments his smile doesn't reach his eyes. In the way music suddenly sounds like memory. He won't tell his friends. He might not even admit it to himself. But your absence becomes a constant presence, and it whispers, not, come back, but become. You were not his lesson. You were his mirror. And when the mirror leaves, a man is left with the raw, jagged pieces of what he never wanted to face. His loneliness, his father wound, his inability to receive without conquering, his fear of being truly known, and therefore truly vulnerable. There is a specific shame that comes for a man when he realizes he could have been more and wasn't, when he sees that he was loved deeply, generously, completely, and chose to meet it with half presence. When he finally understands that what you offered was rare, but not unconditional, that you were willing, but never required to stay. And the woman who leaves with calm, who vanishes without drama, who simply stops showing up, is unforgettable, because her detachment doesn't feel like punishment. It feels like truth, a kind of brutal, holy truth that wraps around his spine and doesn't let go. You became the echo in his ribcage, the silence between thoughts, the void that every future woman will unknowingly compete with. Not because you were perfect, but because you were real, and real cannot be replicated. And here's the irony. In the very moment you pulled back, not out of resentment, but reverence, you stepped into your full power. You became the untouchable, the one he can't decode, the one who loved without groveling, who gave without losing, who left without fracturing. You didn't weaponize your silence, you sanctified it. And now, his mind replays everything, not just your words, but your pauses, your eyes before you turned away, the moments you stayed quiet when you could have screamed, the times you softened when you should have walked. He sees it now. He sees you now, and he wonders if he ever really had you, or if you were always just visiting, waiting to see if he would rise. But that's the tragedy. He never rose, not when it counted. And yet, he can't forget the way you looked at him when you still believed, the reverence in your eyes when you saw who he could be. Not the man he was, but the one sleeping beneath his surface. And that, more than anything, is what haunts him, because he'll never know what it feels like to become that man. In your presence, he will search for the same spark in other eyes, try to recreate the alchemy. He might even convince someone new to love the mask you once saw through, but he will never again be looked at the way you looked at him, with both fire and mercy, with both depth and direction, with the sacred ache of a woman who knows and chooses anyway, until she doesn't. And that's where the story ends. Not for you, but for him. Because the woman who walks away with her soul intact writes a new story. One that begins after the attachment dies. One where she is no longer a character in someone else's myth, but the author of her own. You, the woman who detached without warning, became the initiation he never asked for, but needed. And while he may spend years trying to rewrite the ending, only you will know the truth. You weren't the one who left him. You were the one who finally returned to yourself. And in that return, quiet, complete, irreversible, something ancient within you awakened. Not the part that waits for a man to finally understand. Not the part that longs for apology or recognition or to be chased down in the rain. That part died the moment you realized you were never meant to be completed, only remembered. Not by him, by you. Your detachment was not a rupture, it was a remembering. That your worth does not reside in his realization. That your depth is not a challenge for him to rise to. That your love is not a performance to win his approval. It is a sacred offering. And when unreceived, it is reclaimed, silently, powerfully, entirely. Carl Jung taught that individuation is the journey back to the self, the total, undivided self, not the self contorted to win affection, not the self hidden beneath wounds, the whole self. And that journey always begins with a break from illusion, from projection, from roles that were never yours to play. You broke the cycle the moment you stopped explaining your silence. He may still feel entitled to your presence. He may think the door is cracked, that his charm or timing or late-night apologies might undo the distance. But deep in his body, he knows. The woman is gone. Not angry, not waiting, just gone. And in her place now walks a woman who moves through the world with sacred detachment, who doesn't need to prove her softness to be loved, who doesn't mistake chaos for passion, who doesn't betray herself to avoid making someone else uncomfortable. She walks slower now, breathes deeper, chooses differently, not from fear, but from clarity. Because once you've sat in your own silence, truly sat in it, felt every echo, mourned every fantasy, you become unshakable. You stop trying to fill the void and start listening to what the void has always known. That no man, no matter how magnetic or mysterious or full of potential, is worth betraying your own wholeness. And the irony, it is now that you've released him, that he truly begins to feel your gravity. Now, when you no longer burn for his gaze. Now, when you no longer fantasize about his awakening. Now, when your silence isn't a strategy, but a sanctuary. The feminine in her healed form does not beg. She does not chase. She does not cry out for closure from the emotionally unavailable. She rests in herself. And that rest is terrifying to a man who never learned how to stand on his own, because now he must confront what your presence shielded him from. That love was never about ownership. It was about recognition. And he didn't recognize you. Not fully. Not deeply, not when it mattered most. So now, he carries that weight, that echo, that sacred ache of a woman who left no debris behind, just the imprint of everything he could have met in himself, had he only chosen to. And you walk as a woman no longer bound to what could have been. You walk with the softness of someone who loved deeply, and the strength of someone who let go even deeper. Not because it was easy, but because it was time. You stopped waiting to be seen and became the seer. You stopped offering yourself like a question and became the answer. You stopped collapsing into the spaces he wouldn't fill and built a new world inside your own skin. That is the highest form of feminine power. Not in how she holds a man, but in how she holds herself after him. So let him wonder. Let him search. Let him play out his inner drama in the theater of his mind. Because the woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.